Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me and our mics are working. Maybe someone raise their hand if... Awesome. So thank you everyone for joining us. This session is Strategies for Successful Identity Management at Scale with AWS SSO. My name is Valentine Reed. I'm a Security Solutions Architect focused on healthcare and life science.
And my name is Samuel Folks. I am a Senior Solutions Architect based in the city of Chicago. I was born and raised in Jamaica, which somehow is actually not as hot as Boston has been over the past few days. Welcome to the second in-person staging of AWS Reinforce. We're very, very happy to have you here. And we hope you've been enjoying your time here in Boston and at the conference. And I will turn it over to Valentine to walk you through the agenda and what we're going to be discussing today. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So before we get started, yesterday, as you may have heard, AWS SSO is now IAM Identity Center. AWS IAM Identity Center expands the capabilities of AWS IAM to provide a central place that brings together the administration of users and their accounts. This change does not come with any technical changes or API changes, but it will bring changes to the console so that you can better navigate the service. And then, so for our agenda today, we're going to be providing an overview of the IAM Identity Center service. We're going to talk through the different options that you and our customers have for deploying Identity Center. We'll then talk about how customers migrate from IAM Federation into IAM Identity Center. After that, we'll talk about how our customers work with it at scale and different strategies to deploy it throughout large organizations. And then finally, we'll talk about how you can use Identity Center with attribute-based access control. And so before we dive deep into the service, let's just do a brief overview of the service itself. So IAM Identity Center allows you to create or connect your workforce identities in AWS. This allows you to centrally manage access to your organization and your cloud applications. And so this includes the AWS console, the AWS CLI, and cloud and applications such as Amazon Managed Grafana. And so when we talk about workforce identity, we're talking about the human identities within your organization. And this includes your cloud teams, your administrators, your operators, your developers, and your end users. And so throughout this presentation, we'll be diving deep into how our customers use different features of IAM Identity Center to achieve their workforce identity outcomes within AWS. So core concepts that we'll be using include users, groups, and provisioning. Users, groups, and provisioning. And so these are the workforce identities within your organization, their logical groupings, and the process to provision these users and groups into AWS IAM Identity Center. An identity provider, or IdP, is the system of record that is responsible for managing users, groups, and authentication. SAML and SCIM are standards that are used within IAM Identity Center to manage authentication and the provisioning of identities. Permission sets are a template created within Identity Center that contain IAM policies that get applied to AWS accounts managed by the service. Attribute-based access control is the capability that allows authentication decisions to be made based on attributes of an identity or a resource. And then finally, entitlements are the combination of an AWS account, a user or a group, and a permission set. And so, to illustrate further how entitlements work within Identity Center, you can see that you have an AWS account, a user or a group, and a permission set, and combined they become an entitlement. Later on in this presentation, we're going to talk about how our customers use these entitlements to deploy permissions in their organization at scale.
All right, so right now we're going to actually dive into some of the options that we have for deploying, just various models of deploying with Identity Center. Before we actually get into some of these deployment models though, I would like to spend some time just diving into how Identity Center actually works. Now, as Valentine mentioned, the name was recently changed. So there are a stack of stickers somewhere that I have. If I mess up, if I call it the wrong name, I'll give everyone a sticker. All right, so that's an incentive to really listen. Okay, so how this works is you choose your identity source and you're able to, well, actually that's not true. The first thing you need to do is actually enable the service, right? After which you choose an identity source. Now, there is a plethora of options for the identity source that you can use with IAM Identity Center. You can use the built-in Identity Center directory, which is very convenient. You could use Microsoft AD, which many companies actually already have set up. So it's very convenient to kind of just use what you already have. And you can also use any external IDP that supports both SAML 2.0 and SCIM 2.0. And we'll get into that piece a little bit more later on in the presentation. The next thing you're going to do is you'll need to actually sync these identities into Identity Center. So you need to have a mechanism to actually get those identities that you have in your IDP into Identity Center if you're not using the built-in Identity Center directory. Now, this can be either very easy or it can be not so easy, but the point is it can be done, right? And we will also get into what I mean by, just the ease of which you can do it. You'll then create permission sets. You're going to create permissions. You're going to manage these permissions centrally. And that is kind of like one of the core benefits of using IAM Identity Center, that ability to manage these permissions from a central place. And once you've set up your permissions, you simply assign these permission sets to various AWS accounts or various SAML applications that you would have had set up with Identity Center, and voila, one-click access to the AWS console, which is pretty neat, right? Another very, very cool thing that I will expound on a little bit further on is the ability to access CLI v2 using short-lived credentials. We all know long-lived credentials are not necessarily so great. We all say we're going to rotate them. Sometimes we forget. So let's just eliminate the problem by using short-term credentials. IAM Identity Center actually enables us to do just that. Now, a common question that customers often ask me is, what IDP should I use with Identity Center? Now, consider this just a quick decision matrix for helping you figure out what to use. If you have an existing IDP, whether it's Microsoft AD or some other external IDP, Okta, etc., use it, right? It will make your life much easier. You already have that IDP as a system of record, so you could basically just use the identities and the settings you have and pull that into Identity Center. If you do not, and many smaller businesses and companies don't actually have an AD deployment, or they're not using Okta for whatever reason, so you could simply use the internal Identity Center directory, which is very, very easy and convenient to use, because you can then just define your users, define your groups all in one place. You won't have to worry about pulling these identities into Identity Center. It's all very, very convenient. Eventually, as let's say you're a smaller business, you started out with Identity Center, and you've decided, okay, you've grown to the point where you need to be able to use maybe an IDP with a few more bells and whistles. It's actually, very straightforward to move to some other external IDP while preserving, what you already have set up in Identity Center. Now, if you are going to be moving from Microsoft AD, you will need to, recreate all your entitlements and your assignments, right? And if you are moving to another external IDP, a SAML 2.0 compliant IDP, the very, very cool thing here is that you won't actually need to recreate any of those assignments, right? Once the identifier for each identity, which would be an email address, and the usernames are the same, you basically just connect to that external IDP, set up SAML federation, and it all should just work, right? Neat, huh? Okay, so let us quickly look at just some of these various deployment models, pros and cons, etc. And we're going to start with the Identity Center directory itself. Now, as I mentioned before, it's most commonly chosen by users who do not have an external IDP and would like to quickly get up and running, with IAM Identity Center. Now, the benefits are, there are benefits, right? You can have a central place to manage these identities. As I mentioned before, you don't have to worry about, syncing users and groups across, etc. So, it supports, MFA, which is critical today. Everyone should be using MFA of some sort, with their identity deployments. It supports attribute-based access control, and it's very easy to manage through the AWS console. Okay. So let us move on to Identity Center with Active Directory. Now, one of the concerns customers often have is, okay, well, if I'm going to be connecting my AD to Identity Center, I don't want to have passwords moving over the wire and, Identity Center having access to my passwords and my credentials. That's not a thing. That doesn't happen, all right? Now, there's no password information synchronized to Identity Center when you're set up using Active Directory as your identity store. A consideration, though, is that if you do want to use MFA, which you should be using, I can't say that enough, you will need to have some kind of separate radius setup to manage the MFA there. So your options here are, if you have your self-deployed, self-managed Active Directory setup, you can do a couple of things. One, you could set up AWS managed Microsoft AD and create a two-way trust with your on-premises AD setup, and you can approach it that way. Or, and this is a kind of a lighter lift, you could simply use our AD connector service, which is really kind of like a gateway proxy, that would kind of sit in your AWS account in front of Active Directory and kind of act as that point in the cloud to interface with your on-premises Active Directory. Right, so again, I'd like to reiterate, because this is a very, very common question. There is no credentials, no identity information aside from just user and group info that is going to be synced into Identity Center. Passwords do not travel over the wire to IAM Identity Center. Okay, all authentication happens on the AD side of things. Okay, so let us move on to using Identity Center with other external IDPs. All right. Again, no password synchronized. Let's get that clear. Now, you are able to use Identity Center with any external IDP that is SAML 2.0 compliant. That's like the core requirement. It needs to be SAML 2.0 compliant. Now, if you want to be able to leverage automatic provisioning, and in the next few slides we kind of get into SCIM and how that facilitates automatic provisioning, it will also need to be SCIM 2.0 compliant. Now, another question I often get is, okay, I have more than one IDP. I have Active Directory, I also have Okta or Ping or OneLogin. Which one of these should I use? The answer is simple. The one that you use most often, right? The one where you have most of your users and groups is the one that you really should be using. Right, okay. So let us actually move on to Identity Center with multiple external IDPs. Now, I'll give you the TLDR, and then I'll get into a bit more meat. So the TLDR is that currently, Identity Center does not support SAML connections to more than one external IDP at the same time, right? That's not supported. However, is it possible to use multiple external IDPs with Identity Center? It certainly is. Now, and this is a term that, Valentine and I kind of coined. It's not an industry standard term. We're trying to make it a thing. But you can achieve this by using what we call an aggregator IDP or a bridge IDP. Now, how this works is that IDP would actually present a single interface to AWS. Almost did it. You're not getting any stickers. I almost did it. To IAM Identity Center, right? So it presents a single interface, and then you can actually set up SAML federation from multiple other external IDPs to that aggregator IDP or that bridge, which then presents a single interface to IAM Identity Center. It's a pretty common deployment model. It's a question we get very often, and it works quite well. An example of an IDP that can actually function as this aggregator IDP is Okta Universal Directory, for example. That's a deployment I've seen many times, and it works quite well. Okay, so let us move on to IAM Identity Center and custom SCIM connectors. Now, SCIM, or the System for Cross-Domain Identity Management, is essentially a standard that allows for the exchange of identity information between identity providers. All right, so you can move users, you can move groups, etc., via this standard. And that's key to remember. It's a standard. Now, there are many terms, or a few terms that you'll hear when you're using IAM Identity Center with SCIM provisioning. So you'll hear provisioning, for example. That's one word you'll hear. You'll hear the term deprovisioning. These are just fancy terms which essentially mean adding users to a directory or removing users from a directory. So provisioning, you're actually moving these users, these identities that exist in your external IDP into IAM Identity Center. Deprovisioning is the opposite. You're actually removing them. Now, the SCIM implementation that IAM Identity Center uses is based on the fast-fed basic SCIM profile 1.0. Right? Again, now remember I mentioned before, this is a standard, which means that you can build your own connectors. IAM Identity Center actually exposes a SCIM API that is based on this standard. So if, for example, you happen to be using an IDP, an external IDP, that does not have a native SCIM implementation, such as, for example, Keycloak, you could simply build your own SCIM connector. It's actually not super difficult. The documentation is there. It's all based on a standard. You can whip one up very quickly. Now, it is important to note that there are some external IDPs that do not implement SCIM in a standards compliant way. And you will have issues if you try to use some of these external IDPs with IAM Identity Center. But the key thing to recall here and to remember is that once the IDP uses a standard SCIM implementation based on SCIM 2.0, once it complies, you should have no issues setting up automatic provisioning from that IDP into IAM Identity Center. Okay? Now, this is a topic that kind of is very, it's related to the concept of building custom SCIM connectors. And that is the ability to decouple your directory from your provisioning. There's that word again. So many of our customers, they essentially want to have a single source of truth for their identity lifecycle management. So what they do is they might have an IDP, but they have another tool that sits alongside that IDP that handles all the provisioning of users and groups. A common tool that is used to do that is SailPoint, for example, SailPoint IIQ. Some of you may be familiar with that tool. Now, it's important to note, as was mentioned when I was discussing the previous slide, that as long as this tool uses a compliant SCIM implementation, doing this or using this kind of setup with IAM Identity Center is actually very, very simple. It should work without a hitch. However, there are some of these tools, like SailPoint IIQ that I just mentioned, that does not use a SCIM implementation that's compatible with IAM Identity Center. So that is something that you'll need to, if you want to actually use this deployment model, that is something you'll actually need to check and ensure that it works, before actually trying to, move everything into that system. All right. Now we're going to talk about something that is very, 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 very dear to me personally, and we're going to talk about delegated administration with IAM Identity Center. Now, a quick show of hands. Who here has been using IAM Identity Center, previously known as AWS SSO, like for 2-3 years? Anyone? Fantastic. I too, I was a customer of AWS before I started working for AWS, much like you. And, I started using the product then known as AWS SSO very, very early. And one of the issues that I ran into was, okay, this is great. This is a fantastic, fantastic service. It really solves a lot of problems, for us as a business. But as we grew, we started to realize, okay, this needs to be managed from the management account of an AWS organization. So this means that I will need to give my security team access to the management account of my AWS organization. As we started to grow even more, we realized, okay, well, suppose I want the marketing team to be able to manage their identities for their organizational unit, and I want the sales team to be able to do the same. How can I do that? So I'm very, very pleased to announce that very recently we announced the ability to delegate a separate management account for IAM Identity Center that does not have to be the management account of your AWS organization. So, you can simply choose, for example, maybe an account that is in your security OU, and have your security team actually manage what's going on in IAM Identity Center from that account, which is very, very, very convenient. Also, you have the ability to delegate administrative access to certain users and organizational groups by using condition keys, by using tags, and by just leveraging AWS organizations itself. Now, getting into like the nitty-gritty of how that works is a little bit beyond the scope of this talk, but just to say it clearly here, it is certainly possible to determine which people can administer what groups with IAM Identity Center using various very comprehensive delegation models based on using AWS organizations and tagging. All right, and so if you scan this QR code here, it will actually take you to a blog post that kind of gets into a lot of detail about how you can actually accomplish that. All right, so let's move on here, and we are going to now talk about migrating from IAM federation, which is the method of federation that existed before IAM Identity Center was a thing, to using IAM Identity Center. Now, customers for various reasons are often very hesitant to do this. Don't worry, I am here to put your minds at ease, okay? So before we kind of get into kind of like a pros and cons and a comparison of the two methods, quick show of hands here. Is there anyone here who has used IAM Federation? Okay. Now, again, I used that as well, and it was great. It really allowed us to use our workforce identities to manage access to various AWS accounts. But it did come with a bit of legwork, right? You had to ensure that roles were kind of deployed in each of the accounts that you wanted to manage access to, and there wasn't really a very smooth solution for CLI access through that federation model. Now, I'd like to introduce the idea of using IAM Identity Center, which we now recommend as a best practice to handle, this kind of workforce identity management as it relates to accessing AWS accounts. Now, with IAM Identity Center, you do get centralized management of workforce identity into your AWS accounts. And we spoke about the benefits, right? You have centralized management of permissions. You can, automatically provision your users, via SCIM, etc. But for me, having used these, both of these methods for many years, one of the key benefits here is the ability to generate short-term credentials for CLI access, right? So you don't need to create IAM users and define an access key and a secret key and have them sit forever and hope that your security team is actually rotating these credentials when they should. You can, through IAM Identity Center, simply grab those short, generated credentials that live for a very short period of time from the Identity Center portal and actually use those credentials for accessing the CLI, which is very, very powerful. All right, so let us look at migrating from IAM Federation to IAM Identity Center. Now, again, customers ask about this very often. They're often very hesitant to do this because they don't want to break what already exists, and it's a reasonable concern. Now, I'm here to tell you that moving to IAM Identity Center, it does not modify any of your SAML IDP configurations. It does not disable the use of your IAM users. It does not, destroy or remove any of the roles or policies that you have created in your accounts. So it is very easy to actually set these things up in parallel. If you wanted to, for example, let's say you just wanted to kind of experiment with IAM Identity Center, it is completely fine to do this without breaking anything. It's just, another way, setting up another way of accessing, your AWS accounts. Now, migration is going to be a 3-step process. And you can, 3 steps in your head, if you want to look at it that way, right? So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to migrate your users. And to do this, you'll have to set up, your SAML federation. You'll have to set up a SCIM if you want to use automatic provisioning, which is not a requirement, mind you. And you'll need to move those users into IAM Identity Center. The next thing you're going to need to do is migrate your permissions. So you're going to actually need to kind of export those federated IAM roles into permission set format, which is something that can be done programmatically. And it's not super difficult to do. And the third thing you want to do is you want to migrate your assignments. So you're going to fetch all the user role assignments from the external IDP that you were using with IAM Federation, and you're going to recreate those assignments in IAM Identity Center. So it's a very straightforward process. Much of it can be done programmatically. So there's really no reason to fear actually making that move. Okay. So, all right. So, tips when you are, when you're going to migrate from IAM Identity, migrate from IAM Federation to IAM Identity Center. So you want to ensure that you want to identify if IDP groups are being used in IAM Federation, and if they are, you can actually reuse these groups, when moving to IAM Identity Center integrated with an external IDP. Okay, you want to migrate your organization-wide permissions first. This will make things much easier for you down the line. And any roles that are accessed by IAM federated identities, you're going to want to, basically convert those into permission sets. There are 2 key things here that you will need to avoid, or you should avoid. Now, this solution, this IAM Identity Center solution, is for people. It's workforce identity. It's not for machine roles. So, if you have machine roles, you want to keep those intact. and just use the same system that you've been using to leverage these machine roles in your accounts. And finally, try not to do everything at once, right? The ability to set this up and build this out in parallel with using IAM users is so super convenient. So you don't need to kind of rush to do everything all at once. Take your time, bite off manageable chunks, and build things out over time, right? So with that, I am going to turn things over to Valentine, who's going to talk about working with Identity Center at scale.
All right, great. So once we have our identities in IAM Identity Center, customers want to start scaling and deploying permissions into their organization. And so the question that I most commonly get as the journey is beginning is, how do I do this at scale? How do I do this so that it goes to my 100 accounts or to my 1,000 accounts? And so that's what we're going to be talking about. And so there are several patterns that customers can apply to achieve this. I recommend that customers first identify the permissions and groups that are going to get deployed across the entirety of their organization. The reason I recommend this is this allows customers to really get the most out of the service, where the users and groups who are intended to have access to all accounts, such as the cloud team or the network team, or even the security team, you can deploy those permissions first, give them access to all of the AWS accounts in the organization, and get immediate benefit from the service. Typically, these permissions are the same for each for these groups, and so the cloud admins get the same permissions in each account, and that's why you do this. You identify the permissions applied to all accounts in the organization, and then if you ever need to modify those permissions, you can do it once. And so second, identify the permissions for common, but not necessarily applied to all accounts type of roles and groups. And so this can be things such as EC2 users. This can be the administrators for EKS, for Kubernetes. When you identify these different users and groups, you can also identify the permissions that are common across those users and groups. And so maybe you have 2 or 3 different groups of Kubernetes administrators depending on the application, or maybe you have different groups in each account who need to access EC2. But the permissions for those groups are the same. And so that's typically the second group of people that and I recommend customers identify as they're building out their IAM Identity Center infrastructure. And so finally, third, identify the bespoke permissions that individual accounts and groups have that don't get covered by the other permission sets that we've talked about. Inevitably, customers will have this, and there's different ways that customers can develop these permission sets. One method that I've seen customers do is they'll create a one-to-one relationship between a permission set, the account, and the IdP group. And that way, they're able to very easily understand which groups go to which accounts. And so, to illustrate this a bit further, when in a previous slide we talked about how permission sets are the combination of accounts, groups, and we talked about how entitlements are the combination of accounts, groups, and permission sets. In this illustration, we show that we have cloud admins using the administrator access managed policy, and it's getting applied to all 4 accounts in the organization. With this, the cloud admins have the same permission in the entirety of the organization. And so this uses 4 entitlements, as each assignment is unique. And so to provide another example of this, if any company needs to provide administrator access to their mobile application accounts, the mobile application the accounts are split between dev and prod. Perhaps the administrators are different for each of those. In this case, we have groups that are mobile dev and mobile prod. But the permissions that these groups get are the same. And so in this case, you can see how the permission set is the same. It gets mapped to different groups, which gets mapped to different accounts. And so this scenario can be applied in any situation where you have a common set of permissions but different users. As I mentioned previously, if you had Kubernetes admins or if you had EC2 users, it's a similar concept where you would be able to use the same permissions mapped to different groups and to different accounts. And so, one feature that we've released recently that my customers asked a lot about was the idea of customer managed policies. And so, with customer managed policies and IAM Identity Center, you're now able to provision customer managed policies using the service. Now, when you do this, you're able to attach up to 10 customer managed policies to a permission set, which is similar to how you were able to apply up to 10 AWS managed policies. This functionality allows you to reuse the policies you have. If you have the need to create new customer managed policies in your AWS accounts, you're able to do that as well and provision that access through IAM Identity Center. And so, in addition to the ability to use customer managed policies, you're now able to also use permission boundaries. And so a permission boundary is a guardrail IAM policy that allows you to set the maximum permissions that an identity-based policy can grant to an IAM principal. In this case, your workforce identity coming from AWS SSO. And so this allows you to define the maximum amount of permissions they're able to receive. And so, when you create a permission set with a customer managed policy as a permissions boundary, you must ensure that the customer managed policy has been deployed into all of the accounts that will be using that as a permission boundary. And if you're unfamiliar with permission boundaries, common use cases for it include allowing users to create roles with permission boundaries attached, and so that way you're able to restrict access to a specific set of permissions. And the other use case, of course, is to just limit the maximum permission they're able to receive. And so, up until this point, we've talked about what IAM Identity Center is, how to configure it with your identity provider, and how to apply the permissions within your organization. And so for our final topic, we're going to talk about attribute-based access control and how it can be used within Identity Center to allow your organization to further scale. And so for those of you who may not be familiar with attribute-based access control is a mechanism that allows customers to develop policies and environments that need to be able to scale rapidly, or where IAM roles have become cumbersome to manage. And so it's an advanced technique that not all customers need for their environment. And as mentioned in our previous slides, attributes can be synced in from an identity provider as well. And so when we talk about attributes, we're talking about things like the first name and last name of a user, their department, their job role. And so in this illustration, we have two users, Alice and Bob, and they have department attributes of A and B. And so these attributes are stored within the IdP, and in a situation where a customer is using SAML and SCIM, you can use SCIM to provision the identities and their attributes. Now, there are another set of attributes that some IdPs support, which can be assigned at authentication. This can include things such as MFA and location. And so just as a basic example of how ABAC works within AWS and with IAM Identity Center, Alice and Bob in this case has been SCIM provisioned into Identity Center with their department tags. Alice and Bob are able to authenticate into AWS using the same federated role. However, Alice and Bob receive different permissions, and those permissions depend on what attributes they're bringing into the account. In this case, Alice is able to access EC2 instances that have been tagged with Department A. Bob is able to access EC2 instances that have been tagged with Department B. However, because Bob does not have a Department A tag and because Bob doesn't have a Department A tag, Bob is not able to manage Alice's EC2 instances. However, this is not just an or statement. ABAC also allows you to do and statements. And so it provides you with the flexibility of, in the case of Alice and Bob and their departments sharing an AWS account with multiple EC2 instances, if there are use cases where they need to collaborate, you're able to do so as well with ABAC. And so in this case, we've added a third instance with A and B as department tags, and now Alice and Bob can interact with that resource as they need to. All right, and take it away.
Awesome, thank you, Valentine.
Thank you.
So we're going to just discuss some key takeaways, from some of the things we discussed today, some of the things we may have learned today. One of them is that IAM Identity Center, note the new name, it enables workforce identity on AWS. It provides customers the flexibility to support various identity providers. We can kind of meet customers where they are. And it provides features that allows customers to scale as they build out. We briefly kind of discussed permission sets, which as was mentioned previously, it's helpful to think of a permission set as essentially a basket of policies that essentially determine what a user or a group of users can do in the AWS account that the permission set is actually attached to. We discussed attribute-based access control and IAM Identity Center. And we looked at that as a method of kind of providing additional flexibility with how you can actually manage what your users can access and when they can access it. And finally, I said this a few times, I'm going to reiterate it. It is critical to use MFA with your identity solutions all the time, as much as possible. It's way too easy to actually just break single factor authentication. So please go ahead and scan that link. It actually take you to a page on the AWS website where you can kind of learn more about IAM Identity Center and actually just get kind of get familiar with it and get started using it. So again, my name is Samuel Folks. My colleague here that joined me is Valentine Reed. We hope you enjoyed this session. Thank you so much for joining and listening. And we really hope that there's some things you were able to take from the session and apply as you go forth and build and deploy on AWS. So once again, thank you very much for joining. We hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, enjoy Boston, and please remember to take the session survey and just let us know how we did, right? Give us some feedback. This is how we will improve and be better next time. All right? Thank you all.